That Which Was Withheld. Chapter 2. Small Town Wizard. Apparently, Archprotector Vermigold had more important matters to attend to than teaching her. He claimed that he needed to get some things in order before he could commit to her apprenticeship. His vagueness was unconvincing enough, but she had seen and heard his comings and goings during the week before. He seemed like he was without purpose, aimlessly fussing about while achieving very little. Even so, as she felt that he may have accepted her on a whim, she decided to make full use of his library while she had access to it, in case he changed his mind about their agreement. Perhaps she could continue to impress him, thus securing her place here, at least until winter's end. Several days passed, as she practiced her known spells, and studied but a few of the many tomes in the large library. At night, she continued to sleep upon the jade couch, and when she was too tired or ill to study, she would lay there and look up at the bright sky through the astonishingly beautiful glass roof, with its curved contours that spanned across the entire library. The housekeeper, Amalia, proved to be unflinching in her promise to keep an eye on her, and though she was obviously busy, Nepeta would occasionally catch her hovering at a distance, watching mistrustfully. It was understandable that the woman was suspicious of her, but Nepeta couldn't fathom what horrible acts she might be expecting her to commit if left unattended. After a while, she learned to ignore Amalia's stare, instead shrugging off the disdainful presence with a comparable apathy. While the library contained thousands of useful tomes pertaining to arcane research and the practice of wizardry, it was much to her irritation that all of them were written in the Imperial Dwarven script. Interpreting the jagged runes was an arduous task, and she was far from fluent. This left her with no choice but to constantly flick between tomes, as she referred to an outdated dictionary. It frustrated her immensely, and she found herself wishing that she had dedicated more time to mastering the language when her old friend, Garina, had first introduced her to it. It had seemed so unnecessary back then, when she was 13 years old. Dwarves, and their empire of the Dromean Mountains, had been a dot on the map. They existed in stories, but had no place in her life. Now she was less than 200 miles from their fabled mountains, close enough to see their snow-covered peaks through the library's southern window. Memories of darker stories, previously forgotten, found their way back into her mind. Her father had often and passionately spoken of the dreaded dwarves, but she had never put a great deal of thought into it, until now. She could recall stories of a war, a brief war that had ended a few years before she was born, and she had heard adults complain of the Dromean tax. Presumably Vathny, her home city, along with the other northern settlements, had lost this war and become subject to Dromean law. This put some sense to the memories of her father's anger, yet she had never seen a dwarf until a few days ago. Perhaps they had loyal agents who ruled over Vathny in their stead. Whatever the case, the Dromean Empire undoubtedly still held some power over the humans of the northern plains. Otherwise, there would be no reason for them to pay a tax. She wondered what part an Archprotector might play in all of this. What was an Archprotector, anyway? It sounded like a ridiculously pompous name for a glorified librarian. Nepeta chuckled to herself, but her face hardened as she heard footsteps approaching her place of study. "It's time to begin your apprenticeship," Vermigold had said, finally calling her to his office at the far end of the library. The cozy room was neatly furnished with rich timber shelves and a polished wooden desk, stacked with several piles of meticulously sorted parchments, letters, and a notebook. A wide window overlooked the cliffside courtyard and the sprawling township of Perinch that lay nestled into the hillside half a mile below the villa. The grey-skinned dwarf touched his fingertips together, appearing anxious, before he cleared his throat and spoke. "I've made some arrangements," he began. Then his face hardened, and he looked up at her with a stern expression. "So I should be able to free up a few hours of each day to take you on as my apprentice, and guide your learning."
"Thank you, sir," Nepeta replied. "I'm glad that an Archprotector can make time for his apprentice, given how busy he might be," she added, a little too sarcastically.
"Indeed," Vermigold had affirmed, frowning, but appearing otherwise uncertain about how to respond. After a pause, it seemed that he had decided to ignore her mockery, and continued. "Please, call me Vemigold. I'm a mage, not a knight. Now, let us begin by going over the spells that you already know." As he spoke, the dwarf swept the papers on his desk aside and placed a book, titled Narrated's Arcana, in the center of the desk. "That way, I can get a proper idea of your skill, and what you have missed through your self-learning."
"I had a teacher, actually," Nepeta replied, a little distractedly, as she peered at the book. She recognized the name, Narrated, a renowned imperial mage, supposedly the greatest in history.
"Oh, well yes, I assumed so," Vemigold responded calmly. "But you said you were alone, so you have been teaching yourself since then?"
"Yes."
Nepeta looked back at the dwarf, meeting his stony gaze.
"I've been practicing alone for almost 2 years.
"Very well," Vemigold replied, gesturing towards the tome once more. "Show me the results of your practice, and use this book as a target for any signs that require one."
"Right," Nepeta replied uncertainly, looking from Vemigold to the battered tome, and then back to him. "Don't you want it any more?"
"Ha! I've had quite enough of it, actually," Vemigold replied grumpily, as he paused to glare at the tome. "Start with the basics, and avoid channeling for today. Just show me what you can do without harnessing Craft's breath."
Taking a step back, Nepeta steadied herself and slowly lifted up her right hand in front of her, with her palm facing away from her and her knuckles only a few inches from her chest. "Zygach Orl," she mumbled, barely audibly, reconjuring her familiar white orb lantern. "Fjador, Thwy Orl, Gon," she continued incanting, all the while her fingers drew invisible signs and runes in the air. A small green flame flickered between her fingertips before fading. Then, the battered tome gently rose into the air above the low desk and was tossed across the room with a flicking motion. It lightly impacted against the shelf and tumbled harmlessly to the floor. "Thwy Orl, Feitro."
She glanced sideways at Vemigold's stern expression and clenched fists. He was biting his lower lip, obviously irritated. Once the book had floated back onto the desk, she paused nervously, readying herself for something more potent.
"Luaju Gon."
Her gentle voice quivered slightly as she fumbled the sign and nothing happened.
"Luaju Gon,"
she repeated, more sternly, but still missigned the spell. "You need more vigor," Vemigold growled through clenched teeth as he raised his wand. "Luaju Gon!" His voice boomed as he whirled the wand in front of him, drawing a wide sign in the air the size of a serving platter. A smattering of sickly clear fluid spat from the center of the sign, hissing, spitting, and blackening as it came into contact with the book. "The signs you draw are too small, and you draw them with your fingers individually, rather than using your index or a wand. I've never seen such an awkward technique. It was unlikely that you would manage the first few, but you are obviously—"
"Obviously what?"
Nepeta interrupted sharply, her embarrassment instantly turning into rage.
"I don't need to throw my arms about so exhaustingly. I just need to be more accurate."
Once again, Vemigold seemed shocked by her contemptuous lack of manners, uncertain how to respond. She took the chance to focus her attention on the book, and attempted to clear her mind of all distraction, but the anger remained. She saw the dwarf finally open his mouth to speak, but ignored him as she clearly yet softly incanted,
"Luaju Gon Ult."
Her wrist barely moved as her fingers quickly drew the complex signs, finishing with her index finger pointed at the book. An involuntary shiver shook her as she felt the air in the room turn cold, and it dragged the warmth from her body. A moment later, a booming sound erupted from her fingertips as the same caustic fluid darted through the air with lightning speed, striking the book and slamming it against the far wall with a resounding crash. The fluid spattered across the wall and desk, continuing to hiss and spit as a rancid aroma wafted up from where it was corroding the wood.
"Aju Min."
The fluid fizzled and dispersed into a thin, sweet-smelling steam. Beads of sweat had formed on her brow as the temperature in the room normalized, and she turned back to Vemigold with a slow exhale. He was still glowering, but seemed more pensive than furious. "You used Craft's breath," he muttered finally. "To prove a point. But yes, I broke your rules." Her anger had ebbed away with the effort of the spell, and she wiped at her runny nose with her sleeve. "Sorry." Vemigold shook his head slowly, then muttered, "Your methods are unorthodox, but perhaps that does not necessarily mean wrong." Nepeta raised her eyes to meet his. "What does it mean, then?" "I'm not sure," the dwarf replied, breaking eye contact and looking down at his wand. "I would rather teach you proper form, but I wonder if that would be more trouble than it is worth. You would have to relearn everything." He trailed off into silence, presumably gathering his thoughts. "Tell me honestly, Nepeta, do you think that you can continue this way? Can you maintain your precision, even if the runes you must draw become 10 times more complex?" "Of course," she replied with a scowl, but was surprised when he simply nodded in response, and turned away from her. "I will allow you to continue learning this way, but if I decide that this form is holding you back, I'll accept no argument when we return to the basics, and you start from scratch with proper technique. What say you?" "Fine," Nepeta growled. "I won't make any more mistakes." "Good," Vemigold replied, spinning back towards her. "Please also follow my instructions from now on. And I've noticed your habits. You spend all day sat down. I know you are sickly, but starting tomorrow, we will be taking a walk before your lessons. Being cooped up inside all the time can only be detrimental for your health. And if we strengthen your body, even a little, it will have a noticeable impact on your magic." "Fine," Nepeta replied again, a little more heatedly, but her teacher just chuckled as he scooped up the severely damaged tome and placed it in the center of his desk once more. After running through the rest of her signs, Nepeta was exhausted and wanted nothing more than sleep, but Vemigold insisted that she join him on a brief journey into the township of Perinch, that they might purchase some supplies for her, including some additional clothing, a personal notebook, and a staff. She was not particularly thrilled about returning to Perinch so soon, but was too tired to argue or come up with an excuse, and she certainly wasn't going to tell him about Tahar. "A staff or wand can be used as a conduit to assist with the channeling of Craft's breath," the dwarf began to explain, as she leaned against the side of the cramped carriage, which bumped and jostled down the road. "If they are properly attuned to it, a mage can allow the conduit to take some of the physical stress that comes with channeling. The more potent the magic, the more stressful on the mage's body and mind. A conduit helps in this regard, because it not only shares the load, but most often, the conduit will break before the mage, thus protecting them from receiving irreparable harm in the event that they push themselves too far." Vemigold spoke excitedly, and Nepeta couldn't help but be drawn in by his overt passion. "Of course, a reckless mage could continue to cast beyond that point, and a more powerful mage will need a suitably resilient conduit. I imagine that, as a beginner, a yew or oaken quarterstaff will suffice for you." "How will I know when I'm ready for a more resilient conduit?" Nepeta asked softly, still drained from the recent lesson, but excited at the prospect that she might be able to channel Craft's breath without it causing her such fatigue. "Ha! Most likely you will break your first few staffs, as you learn to sense their potential," Vemigold chuckled. "Oh," Nepeta replied uncertainly, then returned to his original statement. "You said that a conduit could be a staff or a wand. Is one objectively better than the other?" "Well, yes and no," Vemigold replied. "I assume your real question is, why do I use a wand and suggest that you use a staff? The truth is that wands are a little easier to attune to, and I am more accustomed to a wand, as that is what I learned with. Admittedly, the options were far more numerous in Daramon, but here, well, there are no other mages in Perinch, so a walking staff is about the only option." "Does the conduit not need to be magical in origin? I always thought that a wizard's wand had an arcane stone at its base, or was created from the branch of a sacred tree." As she spoke, Vemigold shook his head, looking like he might laugh. She scowled as he opened his mouth to correct her.
A sacred tree? What nonsense. Where might one find a sacred tree?
He chuckled irritatingly as he mocked her.
While a conduit can be magical in its construction, as long as it is crafted from materials that were once alive, it can channel the breath.
So why a staff then? Why not a ladle or a rolling pin? Nepeta asked sharply. Her head was beginning to ache, and the constant jostling of the cart was making her nauseous.
A rolling pin? By Thread's beard, you humans are irrefutably tasteless, the dwarven mage exclaimed, waving his hands dramatically to accentuate his point. But yes, I suppose you could even use a woolen blanket, or the wishbone of a chicken if you so fancied. Though, harder materials are more durable, which is why I would suggest an oaken staff.
I'll take the rolling pin, thanks, Nepeta muttered bitterly. She didn't really care about the conduit's form, but she was angry that he had belittled her and wanted to make him know it.
Come now, be serious. Do you want to be a wizard or a baker?
The Archprotector seemed beyond humour now, possibly exasperated. Enough, she thought, closing her eyes as she replied coldly. Fine. I'll have an oaken staff, please. He narrowed his eyes at her, but she turned away, to look out the side of the carriage and ignore him. An uncomfortable silence hung over them for the rest of the journey.